with me here on the Money Corner last week, you met Charles Davenport, who is a professor of law at Rutgers University, not Columbia University, as I said last week, and David Millstein, who is manager of the tax department at Coopers and Lybrand in Newark, New Jersey. Last week we talked a little about abusive tax shelters, and we're going to broaden the discussion a little this week. Fellas, thinking of tax opportunities, something that's very current right now, the investment tax credit, I believe Congress developed to stimulate economic activity in certain areas. For example, certainly the utilities were given tax concessions to stimulate investment in building in the area of energy output. This really presents an opportunity not only for large investors, but smaller investors as well.
That's correct, Phil. In fact, the investment credit has been turned on and off a few times over the last 15 years, perhaps.
Why does that turn off on, and why does that on and off turn off?
Well, I think it's a question of how Congress felt about stimulating the economy. Perhaps when times were not that good as far as economic growth was concerned, they felt that it was necessary to stimulate the economy, and by implementing an investment tax credit, whereby a taxpayer would recoup 10%, basically 10% of its or his investment via the credit, it was felt to be a good thing. When times got better and there was a need to raise revenue, then Congress decided perhaps to turn off the investment credit and not to allow it. Currently, the investment credit is in there, and it's a benefit which hopefully many people can take advantage of.
But Chuck, when Dave talks about Congress for certain reasons in terms of where the economy is at a point in time, the economic environment, they turn it on, they turn it off. Does that turning on and off really reflect a partisan viewpoint in Congress? For example, is there a Republican response or a Democratic response, or do we find kind of an across-the-board agreement on how taxation should be used? I guess I'm thinking now about supply side and economics and all these.
Well, it's interesting because that shifts like everything else in the political scene. If you remember back in 1981 when there was a massive amount of legislation, largely tax cut legislation, the question was not so much were taxes going to be cut or even what taxes were going to be cut, but was who could offer the most. Could the administration offer more, or could the House Ways and Means, dominated by Democrats, offer more? And there was literally a bidding war in 1981 in which the Democrats on the House Ways and Means Committee continued to, if you will, sweeten or liberalize provisions with the hope of
Then both sides were playing supply-side economics in one sense.
Yes, and it was the Democrats wanted to push their version through rather than the administration's. And the administration, one place where that really shows up is the administration was unwilling to come down and ask for a cut in the estate and gift taxes. And they were put in because the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Dan Rostenkowski, was trying to bid for certain votes, and it was necessary to put
Dave, you shook your head very quickly there.
You don't agree with
No,
that?
I fully agree. I just recall back in 1981, being a tax practitioner, we were anticipating certain legislation, and all of a sudden this estate tax, total overhaul of the estate and gift tax comes in the last minute, and you're absolutely correct. It was a last-minute act by the Ways and Means Committee, which found its way into the legislation.
Yeah, I'm interested, as a practitioner, you anticipated certain things, and you anticipated certain benefits which affected planning and advice to clients. Could you elaborate on that a little?
Oh, sure. As we said last week, there are effective dates to legislation. Legislation which is beneficial, you want to plan to perhaps defer a transaction until the beneficial legislation comes in,
and
vice
all of a
versa.
sudden there was a significant change in the way people were contributing to charity.
Sure. Just like if the, let's say, legislation were to occur, which would perhaps bring the holding period for long-term capital gains back down to 6 months, and somebody was sitting there with a highly appreciated security, 5.5 months old, and we knew the legislation was going to come down soon, and we felt it would, we would clearly suggest to them to perhaps hold on to that until at least 6 months went by to get the long-term capital gain treatment. And there are many examples like that.
There's a whole interesting thing here about the intent of Congress to affect certain economic and social ends, and then the practitioner in terms of how they, in the best sense of the term, manipulate now in terms of what's coming down the legislative pipeline. It's kind of like the practical and the theoretical.
Well, it's your choice of the word manipulate. I think it's just a question of informing our clients as to what the legislation will be and having them, order their affairs appropriately to take advantage of benefits.
However, you're touching on an area now that Chuck and I talked about before the beginning of the program, before the beginning of the taping, and I said that so much of this whole area of taxation is a mystique. It's a mystery to the general public, and you say informing, but most people, I think, are totally awed by it.
Well, it's understandable they should be, because we start out, and at the bedrock, at least of when the Internal Revenue or the income tax was passed back in 1913, was the idea that net income would be taxed. And
in a very small percentage.
Yeah, but at least people had some concept of what net income is. And as we move away from that, and move away from that largely because of things that the Congress adds to the code to influence behavior one way or another, people no longer have any principles on which they can decide questions. Then they have to know what is in the law. They can't sit around the breakfast table and decide, whether or not this is really income or whether there should be a deduction, because there's no longer any broad general principles. And the general principle has been eroded a lot in the Internal Revenue Code now.
Well, I had an example. I had a conversation the other day with a man who is a tax advisor in the firm I work for, Merrill Lynch. He's right at the threshold of the legislative process. He said to me, he sat down and talked to one of his relatives who is on Social Security. He said, hey, you're going to have to get into an estimated tax now because of the minimum taxation. Dave, you can elaborate on this far better than I can. But people are getting hit with whole new situations that affect their life situations because of what I consider this mysterious world of taxation as it rolls out.
Well, I think the point you're referring to is the onset of the taxation of Social Security benefits beginning in 1984.
But that can hit people like a ton of bricks.
It could. Basically, it applies to those individuals with taxable income in excess of $32,000, I believe, and then about 1/2 of the Social Security benefits they receive would be taxable to them. The estimated tax point you mentioned would come into play in the event that withholding is not sufficient to cover the anticipated tax for the year, and that this income would be taxable, therefore estimated taxes may have to be paid on it.
I'm really trying to tie your comments just now, which are precise in terms of the code, back to Chuck's comment, because Chuck said back in 1913 a man knew if he had a salary, some percentage of that salary were taxable. Today, there's a reality that people get caught in a whole new dilemma which really hits them as a great surprise. Today's paper points out that we're just beginning to see the impact of the Reaganomics in terms of the lower income families are paying more in taxes than the very high income families. But it took 2 years of study by a congressional group, Chuck, you can elaborate on this, before people really knew the consequences of the tax policy and the tax legislation.
Well, I don't think there's ever any doubt but what that had to be a consequence, because given the way those cuts were made in 1981, and the fact that at the same time the Social Security tax was going to continue to go up, that there couldn't have been any question but what the people at the lower end of the income scale would be paying substantially the same percentage of tax, whereas people at the other end of the income scale would in fact have a big cut. It's kind of interesting. And not making any defense of high tax rates, because I have no interest in what tax rates are. But the people at the top end got all of their cut in 1981. And then the people throughout the rest of the brackets had to wait until, indeed, even some this year. Which
kind of shows up in inequity. In some ways, I think that's the point.
Well, no, it's not inequitable if you decide that 70% is just too high a rate.
We're at the end of our segment. We're going to have to pause now. Stay with us next week, and we'll try to throw further elaboration on this whole area of taxation and how it affects you and impacts on your standard of living and the amount of money you pay the government. Have a good week. Be back with us on Money Club next week.